Welcome to day two of Housing California's 24th annual conference. I am Congresswoman Barbara Lee, and I proudly represent California's beautiful 13th Congressional District, which includes Oakland and Berkeley, California. First of all, I just want to say thank you to Housing California for the invitation to address you today. Housing California truly has been a leader in advocating to end homelessness and housing poverty long before this pandemic, and I am so proud to work alongside you. If this pandemic has taught us anything, it is the importance of security and stability. We are reminded that housing can be a matter of life or death. Our country was facing an unprecedented affordable housing and homelessness crisis long before this pandemic. And now we see those pre-existing inequalities further exacerbated by COVID-19. We must work towards creating more affordable housing and ending homelessness in California. And to achieve that, it must be addressed with a racial justice lens. Redlining and racist housing policy have shut Black, brown, and Native people out of housing for over 100 years. Nearly 90% of census tracts are still racially segregated, and Black and brown neighborhoods are 2 to 3 times more likely to be deeply impoverished. Housing is a basic human need and a basic human right. We must come together to make sure everyone is guaranteed a safe, stable, sustainable place to call home. We must also create efficient and accountable housing and homelessness systems that will protect people and reimagining growth. Again, thank you to Housing California for advocating for a better future and, yes, for advancing racial equity and economic inclusion. Please stay tuned for day two of this conference to learn and take away from conversations that cover tenant-led housing justice movements, reimagining housing as public safety, and later today, please look forward to a kitchen table talk with my good friend, the former mayor of Stockton, California, Michael Tubbs, and Chris Haney, the executive director of California Budget and Policy Center. Thank you all again.
Well, thank you so much to Congresswoman Barbara Lee for your inspiring words and for your leadership in Washington. We really need so many more like you there. Good morning and welcome back, and thanks to all of you for joining us at Housing California's 2021 Virtual Unconference. I'm Stephen Russell, the President and CEO of the San Diego Housing Federation, and I'm also a proud board member of Housing California's board, an organization that lifts up the voices and lives of those least heard in our communities. And I'm especially pleased to be here in this month of Pride. Let me start by thanking our sponsors and staff and board of Housing California for putting on this unconference. Additional gratitude is due to the conveners, to the speakers, to the partners who took time from their busy days to lend their insight and expertise. And a huge thanks to all of you for joining us here on this journey. Second, I want to offer a reminder about a few tips and tricks to ensure that you have the best possible unconference experience. During sessions, please feel free to chat with the other attendees in the chat box and use the Q&A box to ask questions of our speakers within Whova. For more tips, the user guide is your friend. If you still have questions, you can email us at conference@housingca.org. Again, that's conference@housingca.org. Third, please be sure to visit the exhibit hall following sessions where you can win prizes by participating in our exhibit hall passport activity. Use the hashtag HousingCA2021 on Twitter and Facebook to help those unable to be here to follow the conversation and to tune in to really some of the exciting things we're talking about. You'll see the Housing California team live tweeting sessions as well, and you can go and engage in the conversation there. So we look forward to continuing this unconference experience with you. So lastly, I'm honored to introduce our next session, Housing and Homelessness Hot Topics in the State Capitol, with a panel of experts who are deep in the goings-on in the building. So with that, I'm glad to turn it over to Housing California's own Francisco Dueña. I want to turn it over to Francisco Dueña of Housing Now to kick off the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Can you hear me okay? Wonderful. Appreciate it. And thank you for everybody for joining us this morning. I am excited to be here. And we have a great panel for everyone discussing what is going on in the Capitol on housing and homelessness issues, policy. And we're looking forward to your questions and personally, how we can get you all engaged in these efforts. My name is Francisco Dueñas, as Stephen mentioned. I'm with Housing Now. We are a statewide housing justice advocacy coalition. You can find us at housingnowca.org. We have coalition partners throughout the state. We're a big tent coalition. And let me pass it over to some of our other panelists to introduce themselves so that you can hear from them. Mark, can I hand it over to you first?
Absolutely. Thank you, Francisco. My name is Mark Stivers. I'm with the California Housing Partnership. We are a statewide nonprofit that does federal and statewide advocacy for affordable housing. And we provide a lot of technical assistance to nonprofit developers of affordable housing as well. I do the advocacy work.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you for being here with us. Cynthia.
Hey, Francisco. Hello, all. So happy to be here. So my name is Cynthia Castillo. I am a policy advocate with Western Center on Law and Poverty. We're a nonprofit that advocates on behalf of Californians experiencing poverty. And specifically, we try to reach our work through the lens of racial and economic justice. We've got three primary areas of expertise, which is access to healthcare, public benefits, and of course, housing. And in our roles at Western Center, we play four roles. First, as a legal support center, providing technical assistance to legal aid organizations across the state. Second, engaging in impact litigation and attempting to make change through the courts. Third, engaging in legislative and budget advocacy, which is much of what I'll be speaking on today. And then finally, we engage in administrative advocacy at the state and sometimes at the local level. So really happy to be here. Thanks.
Thank you, Cynthia. Appreciate it. And our final panelist, Christopher.
Thanks, Francisco. Hey, everyone. Chris Martin, Policy Director here at Housing California. Of course, everyone knows Housing California has a vision where everyone has access to an affordable place to live. And we advocate also on behalf of people experiencing homelessness and for housing stability. So yeah, I'll leave it there. Great to be here.
Thank you, Christopher. And thank you for the invitation, for being here today. Let's get started with some of the insights from our panelists. Just to give folks a brief breakdown, we've got our presentation today sort of in three different buckets. We're going to start off with budget and some of the developments in that area. Then we're going to move over to legislative policy. So, you know, more of the statutory work. And then we're going to round out with some administrative advocacy. So hoping that this is, you know, if you have particular questions, again, please use the Q&A. And if there's additional things you'd like to see included, also put that in the Q&A so that we can incorporate it into our, maybe our Q&A section. Let me get started by turning it over to Mark. Mark, the legislature, both the Senate and the Assembly, just wrapped up what is sort of their final version of budget and sent that over to the governor. We know that there are still negotiations, you know, happening there. What can you tell us about where things stand in regards to affordable housing production, and what impact will the current budget as proposed have?
Great. Thanks, Francisco. I think the big news here is that we actually don't have a final budget yet. The Senate and the Assembly have sort of agreed on their version. The governor has his version still. And normally the fiscal year starts next Thursday, July 1st. And normally we would have all this wrapped up by now, and we are still in negotiations. They canceled a budget committee hearing today, which is further signaling that we don't have a deal yet. And so we are sort of in a bit of an uncharted territory. I'm optimistic that this will be resolved fairly quickly, but So what I'm going to talk about is not the final budget, but I'm going to kind of put it into two categories: things that I think are super likely for affordable housing and things that are maybes. And I want to sort of preface this by saying that no matter what happens, we are in a historic territory. In my 25-year career, we have rarely ever spent state general fund money on affordable housing through the budget. I mean, remember once in the year 2000, during the first dot-com boom, we had $500 million. We thought that was humongous. And this year we're talking about billions of dollars, no matter what. So what are some of the big things we're likely to see? Starting at the top, there's going to be somewhere probably between 2.2 and 3.5 billion dollars for the Home Key program to convert hotels, motels, but possibly other properties as well into affordable housing. Chris will probably talk more about that. The state is committing $1.75 billion to help bring about 90 HCD projects to construction. These are projects that HCD has made awards to over the last couple of years. They are waiting for low-income housing tax credits. They're sort of in the queue as we have a shortage of tax-exempt bonds and tax credits to make these projects move forward. And essentially the state is going to replace all that tax credit equity with this money and just move these projects forward to construction. That is an unprecedented sort of move on the state's part. We are likely to see $300 million to preserve at-risk properties, those that are at risk of converting from affordable to market rate. I think the first priority there would be projects that have been in the HCD portfolio for some time, but it will probably go beyond that as well. We'll probably see another $50 million for something called the Low Income Weatherization Program, which brings solar power and energy efficiency to existing affordable housing. And we'll see $250 million in the Infill Infrastructure Grant Program. All of those things I am 95% certain will be in the final budget. So I would, go place your bets now. The things in the maybe category, number one, and these are things that the legislature has proposed, but the governor has not yet signed off on. So we're sort of in a wait and see mode. The legislature has proposed an additional $100 million for farm worker housing, additional $500 million for foreclosure prevention. And that is generally geared at buying up 1 to 4 unit properties, single family homes, duplexes, fourplexes that are at risk of foreclosure and selling them to tenants and or land trusts. But that may be expanded to do properties up to 15 units. And in theory, it could even be expanded beyond that to do existing, existing market rate housing that we could convert to affordable. The legislature has further proposed $30 million for regional housing authorities and regional trust funds. And then lastly, $50 million for something called the Golden State Acquisition Fund, which is community development financial institutions who take that $50 million, leverage it 3 to 1 with additional private capital, and then make that money available to affordable housing developers to buy land that can be then used for affordable housing. So all of these things, even if we just did the likely, it's super historic. And if we get to the maybes too, it'll be gravy. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. And I think we're gonna run through this section first with all our panelists, and then maybe we'll take questions at the end. So because we already have some questions for you, Mark, already. Let's turn it over to homelessness. We know that both the budget and the legislature have proposed bold plans on funding around homelessness. What can you tell us, Christopher, about where things stand?
Yeah, thanks, Francisco. Yeah, I think, to kind of build off of what Mark said, it's a pretty historic year on the homelessness front as well. The last 2 years 3 years, we've had one-time allocations in the neighborhood of 500 to 650 million. And this year it's quite different. We saw this governor come out in his May revise with a $12 billion proposal to end homelessness, a multi-year proposal. And he really focused on a few different areas, as Mark talked about with the Home Key program, a really robust investment there of $3.5 billion. But also one thing that the governor talked about in his May revise that I think is kind of the first of its kind, which is ending family homelessness. He kind of set this goal that in the next 5 years, he'd like to see family homelessness become a thing of the past. And so he really proposed pretty robust investments in our Department of Social Services programs, things like the Housing Support Program, the Homeless Assistance Program, the Bringing Families Home Program, things at DSS that really are focused on families and ending family homelessness. So really scaling those investments. And so that was kind of a first of its kind. I think the legislature then in their final budget looked at about $20 billion or so in investing in homelessness. And one of the key differences here is that the legislature, for the first time in my memory, put forward an ongoing source of funds to address homelessness. This is the first time we've seen this. We've seen 1-year allocations over the past few years. And the legislature in their final budget actually sent to the governor an ongoing fund for homelessness to go to local jurisdictions and address homelessness in the broader sense of addressing homelessness. Of course, Home Key is really focused on acquisition of properties like motels and hotels and beyond. But the program that the legislature sent is really looking at things like rental assistance and services and housing stability services, which is kind of the broader portfolio of needs around homelessness, but also allowing to be able to use for the operations for things like Home Key and other developments. And so that was really, really huge to see the legislature put that in there at $1 billion annually. It's the first time we've ever seen that happen. Of course, that is a point of difference between the governor and the legislature this year. And I know all of us, the big city mayors, our Bring California Home Coalition is really pushing for that to be included in the final budget. It really goes a long way towards ending homelessness and stating that this is a priority. So the other piece of difference I would note is that the legislature put funding through Home Key through federal resources, which is a little bit limiting in nature because you can't use it for ongoing operations. So the governor put those resources through the general fund, which is a key difference, and hopefully that can be put forward in the final budget. We'd like to see that used through general fund to allow for those operations of those units. But overall, this is a really historic year, and I think we're really hoping to see this final budget include that ongoing funding to really see those measurable reductions in homelessness and finally see what we need at scale. So this is hopefully looking to be here on the homelessness front as well. And I'm wondering, Francisco, if you could talk about kind of where we're at with the tenant rent relief aspects and anything included in the budget and what's currently happening there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll tag team this topic with Cynthia. So there's a couple of different areas we'd want, obviously, folks to have on their radar. One, as many folks probably know, the state is in the process of trying to disperse billions of dollars for emergency rental assistance. This is government funds that were allocated in the various different COVID stimulus bills. SB 91, the bill that was passed at the end of January, is expiring on June the 30th. And so we think that will round out the second pot of money, or federal money on this, or it's actually probably like the third wave of money if we're counting correctly. But in total, it's I think at $5.6 billion. I maybe Cynthia, you can correct me on that. Again, 5.2, wonderful. And that's again for emergency rental assistance. And so we are likely to see some additional, language, bill language to be able to modify currently SB 91 that is regulating that money getting out. In addition to that, separate from that, advocates have been calling for, need for greater funds for eviction prevention and defense. And this is an effort that has a corollary bill that is working its way through the Capitol, which we will, also talk about later, AB 1487. But on the budget side, we have been calling for greater funds for legal representation for tenants at risk of eviction. Nationally, the statistic is around 3% of tenants who go to eviction court are represented. 81% of landlords are represented in that situation. So there's a huge disparity there. And, in addition to the legal services, we're also providing or calling for funds that could pair that with tenant education and outreach so that we can sort of intervene even before an eviction gets filed. Cynthia, what can you tell us about, what did I miss out about that? Oh, the money amount, actually, why don't you include that, and then anything else I missed?
Sure, and I kind of also want to take a step back, because when I was invited to this panel and I saw hot topics, the first thing I thought of was extending eviction protections. And I know many people watching are, watching with bated breath. And we all know that we've been basically consumed by the impact of COVID-19 and the economic fallout that we're feeling from the pandemic. And, we've been basically in crisis mode for the past 2 years, trying to ensure that renters are not pushed into homelessness. And, we know this, and I think Barbara Boxer, she might as well just drop the mic right then and there at the beginning of this panel with her video, is because our communities were already impacted and rent burdened before this crisis hit. And now we're looking at a much more dire situation. And especially for our renters now, we're looking at a June 30th eviction moratorium. And it is the 23rd today. I mean, I want to reiterate this for the people that are watching, because it's so infuriating that we can't tell tenants, that give them an assurance that these eviction moratorium will be extended a little bit further down the road. And especially during a time like this, it's not something you can't just find a new apartment in a day. It takes some time. And what we know now is that there's probably tenants across the state that are making decisions about this right now. And so that I just want to reiterate for Western Center is a crisis that's impacting disproportionately people of color, undocumented, people with disabilities, seniors, you name it. It's really concerning to us. And, what we know is that there will likely be a bill in print on Friday so that it can come to a vote on Monday. And, we had expected this bill in print earlier in the week. And so we know that the deal is just not done. The ink is not set, similar to Mark and his conversation on the budget. It is historic in a way that this has been being pushed out further and further. And so there's a deadline of June 30th coming up very quickly. A couple other things I wanted to note on this is that, Western Center, other partners are really requesting that we extend the eviction moratorium for at least until the end of September. We'd really like it to be connected to low-income unemployment rates. But we want to make sure that folks aren't saddled with debt. They haven't, this is something that happened through no fault of their own. And so ensuring that they're not followed by the rent debt, that this doesn't impact their credit, that this doesn't impact their ability to find housing in the future. These are all aspects that we're really looking for in this bill that we hope to see on Friday. And so that way our tenants are protected, go through this crisis. What else did I miss? We really like to see a little bit more edits to 91 to ensure that the funds that are out there, as Francisco noted, the 5.2 billion, the last data that we've seen is that very little of that has gone out to renters or landlords. And so we want to make sure that if there's money on the table, that we aren't evicting folks, and that we wait till all the people that are eligible get these funds. And so that is definitely another piece for us too. I think it is important that we get these funds out as fast as possible and ensure that this online application that at times is burdensome for folks who don't speak English or English is their second language, they might need assistance, that process is, sped up so that we get that money into folks' pockets as soon as possible. So those are just a couple of things as I'm thinking about 91. Definitely the hot topic, really hoping to see something next week so that the members of the legislature can really protect their landlords and tenants, and we're talking about mom and pop landlords as well, and ensuring that folks are made whole. And that is what the governor has, he has put himself on the line and said that he is going to cover 100% of the back rent, and then going into even prospective rent. So that is a large commitment that we believe is a fantastic commitment that we'd really like to see happen really quickly. And I just pulled it up. So as of last month, $32 million has been spent in rental assistance when there's a lot out there. So you can see that there's a very large gap. And then Francisco, I'll hop into 1487 a bit, and then maybe if you have anything else that I missed. 1487 is a fantastic bill that Western Center is proud to co-sponsor with Housing Now and others, and really would create a statewide eviction defense program to support, education and the legal representation of tenants at risk of eviction. And so as we know, we're concerned that there might be a huge eviction tsunami. This is incredibly important to be passed alongside with any protections and extensions within 91. So that is a huge priority of Western Centers, and really proud to be working on that bill. I'll pass it back to Francisco if I missed anything on that.
Thank you, Cynthia. I appreciate it. I think that gives a good overview. The only thing I would add is on the budget request for the eviction prevention and outreach, tenant education and outreach, the funds that would be part of AB 1487. We're asking for, or I think in the legislative version, there were $120 million. I think that is framed as both tenant eviction prevention as well as foreclosure, sort of using some of the language from previous interventions. And so we are going to be doing further advocacy to make sure that AB 1487 programs that we are hoping to fund are able to align with that budget request that's currently in there. So that's the only thing I would add. Why don't we stop? There have been a few questions already in the chat. Mark, I think you answered a question about developer fees. Can you just mention it for everybody so everybody hears that, and maybe they might have missed it in the chat?
Yeah, so the question was with respect to that $1.75 billion that would replace tax credit equity in the developments that HD has already funded. And the question was, would developers still have access to developer fees even though there are no tax credits? And the answer is yes. HD would still allow a developer fee up to the HCD limits, which would have applied anyway because these developments already have HCD funding. So nothing has changed there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mark. Appreciate it. And Christopher, there was also a question about where the ongoing funding around homelessness would come from.
Yeah, those resources this year would and ongoing would come from the general fund. So it provides for some flexibility there, and is out of the robust general fund that we have this year.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. Looking at the questions from the Q&A, there is a concern of who exactly will pay for the 100% of the past due rent. Newsom's, I'm reading the question here. Newsom's promise is great, but how feasible is it? Cynthia, what do you say to that?
Sure. I mean, we are getting funds from a combination of federal dollars, a bunch of federal money that has come our way. So we have the money. We have 5.2 billion that is assigned to this. It's hard to say how much the need is out there. There's different numbers about the need, but we actually believe that the 5.2 billion investment to go towards past rent is a large, huge investment. And I'll note that of all the industries, the rental and landlord issue, the rent issue, this is unprecedented. California is going to make them whole. Like no other industry is being given this buyout in a way. And so it's historic in that sense. And also more the reason why we believe this deal should be said and done. We would love to see this passed by the legislature. And I think the biggest issue about how feasible this is how fast we can get that money out to people. Because I'm sure you guys have read some of the hangups, but the program and the application can be a little bit burdensome. There have been efforts from HCD to actually simplify the process. So they actually knocked off like 15 pages off the application. And so we're really glad to see, but are hoping that we can ramp this up because depending on how much of a timeline we have, we would need to get all of that money to folks as fast as possible. So I think it's not much about the money, it's more about the ease and ability to get that out as soon as possible. Francisco, let me know if you have any other thoughts on that one.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is folks should check out policy links. They have a rent debt dashboard called Rent Debt in America. Currently, that estimate for California is set around 3.5 billion. So this 5.3 should be enough to cover us. Yeah, so let's get the word out, folks. That is one of the main focus, like you said, Cynthia, just having folks apply. There was a question, Chris and Mark, about tribal communities. And I'm just wondering if there was anything you all wanted to mention about tribal then within the, I don't know, if within the context of the budget, I guess, and then we'll see if there's anything else that comes up as we transition into the legislature conversation.
So I wouldn't say specific to the budget, but in general, state affordable housing programs have now really put great effort into supporting tribal housing development. At the low income housing tax credit program, there is a Native American set aside. We fund probably 2 developments a year statewide exclusively in tribal communities. We can do more. The Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities program now will fund at least 1 tribal development per year. HCD, as a result of AB 1010 of last year, is sort of prioritizing tribal developments within its programs as well. So any sort of resources that expand affordable housing development generally will get out to tribes because each of the programs is kind of ensuring tribal access to these programs.
Thank you, Mark. Chris, did you have anything to add there?
No, I think Mark hit it. I think it is a challenge on the homelessness piece. It is tough, but the COC resources, especially when they come from the state, are very flexible in that they can be used in tribal communities and in coordination with tribal communities, but also for undocumented people as well. So that's one of the key pieces of coordination, is working with the local continuum of care to make sure those resources are used effectively and equitably. So
wonderful. So there's a few additional live questions in the Q&A. We will come back to them. We will have a Q&A section towards the end of our broader presentation. But let me transition us into discussing some of the developments in the legislature around some of the other topics that have been moving forward in the Capitol. So things like land use, development, and all of this other stuff. In general, as I'm sure many of you all know, there are over 100 bills that were introduced around housing and homelessness. And we have passed one deadline within the legislative calendar where bills had to get out of their what's called their house of origin, meaning whether it's assembly or the Senate, wherever they were first introduced. Why don't we do an overview of a highlight of what are some of the bills that folks should have on their radar. Cynthia, can I have you kick us off?
Sure. So it's interesting. It's been a very exciting year in terms of land use. And that might be part of the reason that we might be focusing so much on production and land use is because there have been such big issues on landlord tenant. And so much of the bills and energy have been more on the land use side. But let's start with, the Senate housing package. So the Senate has presented a list of bills. They're all in a row from one another, about 6 related to housing production. And this is the second year, sort of an extension of a conversation that had happened last year. And if we recall, and I know this sounds like a million years ago, but right before March of 2020, Governor Newsom had made this, his January budget proposal was so focused on housing and homelessness. It was historic. I'd never seen anything like it. He had spent almost 2 hours of his whole January budget proposal really focused on these issues. And then we come to March And a lot of that conversation had to be shut down or really kind of refined. And so what we have in the Senate housing production is sort of a 2-year effort to really double down on producing more housing across the board. And sort of a response to years that what felt like for many legislators and a lot of folks felt like years of sort of slow production rates and slow movement in that space. And so it led by Tony Senate Pro Tem Atkins, she enlisted a couple of her colleagues, and I'll just go through a couple of those just to highlight. SB 6 by Caballero. This is called the Neighborhood Homes Act, which would have authorized residential development on existing lots, currently mostly kind of zoned for commercial use, commercial office space, retail space, strip malls, large big box retail spaces, if you can think of it that way. And they would make those projects eligible for SB 35 streamlining. So this is sort of, and I will say on the Senate bill package, they really tried to break up each bill to kind of tackle one kind of issue. And so, a lot of folks have been identifying lack of production and saying, think about it in an innovative way. Let's think about, creating development in sort of other places that were zoned for other reasons. I will say, Western Center and, some of our partners have been interested in the Senate bill package in particular because, we would love to see higher numbers of affordability required within each one of these bills. So I say that up top, it's great that the Senate is thinking innovatively about housing production, but, at least from Western Center's point of view, it's absolutely important that we keep affordability at least at 20% in these bills. Getting them out of the gate with numbers. I think a lot of these bills, when they were first put in print, there was just a blank about how much affordability would be required. And so, for us, it's always a give and take. And, we appreciate the wanting to produce more housing, but we absolutely think that we need to focus and ensure that, that our lowest income, no income individuals have an opportunity to, access some of this housing. In addition to SB 6, we have SB 9 by Pro Tem Atkins. This one's would allow homeowners to create a duplex or subdivide an existing lot in residential areas. And these projects would be considered ministerially without discretionary review. And so again, you'll see the theme of streamlining, thinking about housing in a different way. SB 9 is really focused on subdividing existing lots. That takes us to SB 10, Wiener. This one would allow cities to streamline and upzone areas close to transit and allow a parcel to be zoned up to 10 units within that parcel. And as we understand it, this is sort of, like I said, SB 10, and some of these bills are repeats from before. This bill originally was an effort to help local governments in meeting their rezoning obligations under the housing element law, and which we know for many cities and counties are substantial. In particular, this bill, and I'm kind of glossing over, they're not, slam dunk easy bills. A lot of these bills have significant opposition from, perhaps it's the NIMBY side, but it's also some of, equity folks are concerned about some of these bills as well. But, ensuring that, we're producing, not displacing, not leading to gentrification. These are all aspects that are important to myself, at least when we're looking at these bills throughout the year and as they continue to progress. And so those are sort of some of the hot pieces of the Senate bill package. I know Mark knows about these ones too. So Mark, let me know if you want to pop in on any on the Senate bill package. I'll give you space for that if you want to talk on any of these.
I will leave it at that, and we'll talk about some other bills, but unless people
Perfect.
have questions there.
Like Mark and I can talk about this for a really long time, guys. So.
And there was a question about the labor provisions. I will come back to that more generally. Perfect.
So now passing on a little bit more from the Senate bill package, there's a couple of other hot bills that I'm sure some folks are aware of. AB 1401 Friedman, which would eliminate minimum parking requirements within a half mile of transit. Fantastic idea. Western Center appreciates the idea that we want to lower these parking minimums. Love the idea of transit-oriented communities and ensuring that folks are able and live close by, transit. We do have an oppose unless amended on that bill, just because we have some concerns about there being a lack of value capture. We would love to see this, just a couple amendments on this bill to ensure that, developers, affordable developers are able to take advantage of the space near transit, and that it doesn't lead to competition between the market rate and affordable developers. And if there's, all kinds of development near that space, we'd love to see affordability. And so that's another big issue for us. But absolutely, I think you can kind of see that there are way more bills kind of focusing on building near transit and building out those areas. And of course, we appreciate that and want to ensure that those communities, if it's a longstanding community, that they're not displaced and that they have a say in sort of the building that comes near in their community. So 1401 is a hot one. 1401 is a hot one. Definitely something that I would recommend folks take a look at. There are other bills. Gosh, I have such a long list, and I'll just have to pick a couple other ones. So there is SB 490 Caballero, which would create the Housing Acquisition and Rehabilitation Technical Assistance Program. This would provide expertise and guidance on how to acquire and preserve unsubsidized rental housing. And this one, Caballero, we're absolutely in love with this bill, really supportive of 490. There's a couple other bills related to housing element to AB 215, which would create a mid-cycle housing element review process. Very interesting, kind of technical bill, but we're looking forward to working with a lot of these members to kind of nail down these ideas around their housing element. One other one that I wanted to, that is just one that I appreciate, is AB 1043, which is now Brian, new member that just came in, which would just create a new income category for 50% AMI or below called acutely low income. And it's unbelievable how a simple bill like this, and this is why I elevate it, because I love simple bills, creating that new AMI area or framework actually assists so that we can build the housing for those folks that are 15% AMI. And we know that they deeply lack affordable housing across the state for this specific AMI level. And because they weren't recognized in statute before, it would be hard for a developer to actually really, work hard to improve that or include that kind of housing in their development. So simple bill that we're in support of. And I'll stop there. There's a lot out there, but maybe we can bounce around.
Thank you, Cynthia. Appreciate it. As you said, there's so many bills that are folks are keeping their eye on. Let me turn it over to Mark. I know these issues overlap, but we were, I'm going to ask you about some of the production development bills in the legislature.
Yeah, let me focus on two in addition to the ones that Cynthia mentioned.
Yeah.
And these relate more sort of directly to the development of affordable housing. One is AB 1423, and this is a bill that we are sponsoring with Bridge Housing that would allow HCD's funds to come into a development during the construction period. Right now, HCD makes an award, the project gets built, and HCD money comes in at the very end. And the developers have to borrow money for that 2-year construction period to fund the construction. If HCD money came in during that construction period, we could save hundreds of thousands of dollars in interest per property. So that's something that we think is a very key way to reduce the cost of affordable housing. And we are working with that. The bill is so far had unanimous votes, and we are optimistic. We are working with HCD on terms of some of the details. A second bill I will talk about is AB 989. And some of you may be aware of an existing law called the Housing Accountability Act. It says that a local government can only deny an affordable housing development for one of 5 very narrow reasons. The law is good. The issue is that if a local government denies the development anyway, most affordable housing developers are not willing to take 2 years in court and hundreds of thousands of dollars to actually enforce the law. And so the idea of AB 989 is to create a housing accountability committee, similar to what 4 other states have, that would be an administrative process to resolve these disputes. And the idea is that we could have a decision within 90 days from a state entity of whether the local government, legitimately denied the project or needs to approve the project because they did not follow the law. And that's something that we are very hopeful that will move forward this year. And I'm going to stop there for now. A lot of the other bills Cynthia talked about, but we will come back and talk about the labor stuff under the themes section that I think is coming just very shortly.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Mark. Chris, what can you tell us about some of the bills that are focusing on homelessness?
Yeah, we had quite a few bills to start this year, kind of a similar theme. And one thing I want to mention real quick, I'm sure we'll talk about in a second, is the 12 bill limit and how that's really severely impacted a lot of bills in the legislature this year. Most notably, many for the homelessness piece, a lot of homelessness bills were cut because of that. But this year we saw a pretty robust interest in the legislature this year around homelessness. Voters continue to identify this as a top priority. We even had a poll recently that showed 98% of Californians naming homelessness as a top priority for our state, which I don't know that polls at 98%. So voters are really focused on this, and therefore legislators are really focused on this issue. And so what we saw this year was a wide variety of bills introduced. We saw, a pretty historic bill in AB 71, which was a bill from Assemblywoman Luz Rivas that put together its first of its kind ongoing revenue source through an actual source of revenue, like outside of the general fund. This was created through two different, quote unquote taxes. One of them is a federal tax that was created under the Trump tax cuts law that prevents corporations, large multinational corporations, from stashing profits overseas. And then the other piece was a restoration of our corporate tax rate. Believe it or not, our corporate tax rate has gone down by 1% since 1980 over the last 41 years. So this bill would have created a ongoing revenue of about 2.4 billion utilizing those resources. And with strong accountability. It was a really great bill, fairly long, and that's because it is very multi-sector, multifaceted in nature, and really comprehensively overhauling the way we do homelessness programming in the state. That bill miraculously made it all the way to the floor. Typically, tax bills do not make it very far in the state legislature. And thanks to the incredible work of Assemblywoman Luz Rivas, she got that bill all the way to the floor. Unfortunately, with the discussions in the budget this year, members were not willing to go up on that at this moment. So the bill was converted to a 2-year bill, but I know that the Bring California Home Coalition, which is a very broad coalition of over 350 organizations statewide, is committed to this ongoing and is going to continue that work, pick that up back when we can in the winter, and move that forward. But additionally, the legislature coming out of the Appropriations Committee announced a package of bills around homelessness, which included AB 71 and a few others. There was a bill from Assemblywoman Quirk Silva around creating minimum safety standards within our shelters around the state. We had AB 816, which is from Assembly Member David Chu, and that's a Housing California sponsored bill around accountability around homelessness, creating this vision in which we reduce homelessness by 90%. We had a few other bills, AB 258 from Assembly Member Villapuwa, which created or required shelters to follow the low barrier standard and create or remove those barriers to entry to those shelters. That bill was converted to a 2-year bill, unfortunately, as was another bill that Housing California was sponsoring with a large group of equity and reentry organizations. This was including Western Center, AB 328. This is from Assembly Member David Chu. And that bill really was focused on the issue of reentry housing with people exiting prison, formerly incarcerated individuals that need resources to address housing. And that bill would have redirected cost savings. Our state is closing prisons and redirected those cost savings from closing those prisons to be used for a new program to address the needs of formerly incarcerated people experiencing homelessness. Unfortunately, that bill was converted to a 2-year bill, as well as many others. So I think when we pick back up in the winter, we're going to see quite a few homelessness bills move forward. But of course, there is still some moving forward this year, and a pretty comprehensive package of bills that the Assembly put forward.
Thank you, Chris. I appreciate it. Cynthia, I know we wanted to have you mention a little bit this advocacy around the equitable production letter. Should we do that now, or do you want to wait until the theme section?
Sure. I think, either way, so maybe I'll just jump into it. I'm really, really proud of an effort there, even before my time. A lot of, equity housing production groups have been kind of curious about how we can really ensure that when we are producing this affordable housing or housing across the state, that we don't displace or lead to further gentrification, and how we can really support our communities and make sure that their voices are really elevated in conversations about production. And so we actually came up with a 5 principles to ensure that housing production legislation meets the very minimum standards for equity. And we released that last week, and we'll likely be promoting it a little bit more after SB 91 conversations wrap up. But in particular, just to highlight, I think a lot of groups are interested in production and want to ensure that, a couple of principles are taken into account. And for first one, protect low income families and communities that are vulnerable to displacement. And, as we know, because of, differing pressures, we've seen, the makeup and of very vibrant communities change really rapidly. And with that comes a loss for a lot of those communities. And so we want to make sure that when we're producing this housing across the state, that we're protecting those communities from displacement. Second, we'd like to respect those voices. Many folks have been historically disenfranchised from these processes, and land use and housing production seems like an abstract concept, but really it's sort of the shaping of all of our communities. It's really quite personal, and we want to ensure that those in communities that have been historically disenfranchised, that they have the ability to participate in public meetings and have that self-determination for their communities that they obviously have a lot of care for. 3, we'd like to preserve and strengthen, policies that promote housing development for those at the most need at the bottom of the income spectrum. That is a really big focus of Western Center. We have cost pressures in California, but for those at the very bottom of the income spectrum, it's nearly impossible to find a home that's affordable, and they are lacking the most units. And so for us, it's absolutely important to start from the bottom up and ensure that the folks that the most need are dealt with, and that actually just helps everyone overall. So really big key for us. And then the last 2 would be to ensure that the policies that we create value, for a developer, are recaptured and used to either build out affordability or create resources to dedicated to affordable housing production. So this sort of land value capture scheme is incredibly important. We think that is an absolutely fantastic tool that we can use to leverage and ensure that the state actually creates the units, the affordable units that they are setting out to do. It's one thing to plan, but then actually getting it done. And then 5 is to ensure that, land use planning and siting and determining, where we're build advances public health. And, we've known that a lot of communities have, suffered from environmental racism. And with our lofty goals of production, it's absolutely critical that, these low income, people of color aren't relegated to toxic waste sites or close to oil and gas drilling that have led to a lot of health issues. So absolutely key. We are completely arm in arm aligned with our environmental justice folks, and have been really actually working collaboratively with a lot of people, and in particular in the environmental movement, to sort of all kind of, hold hands together on this and ensure that we're building smart, and we're not, further, hindering communities' abilities to stay healthy and remain healthy in the communities. So absolutely excited about that, and more to come in the next coming weeks about how we're going to use these 5 principles to really influence the production bills that we're seeing in the legislature.
Thank you, Cynthia. I appreciate it. I just wanted to briefly, before moving on, mention 2 bills that are sort of tenant protection focused. And, these are actually on the sort of regulating harmful speculation, I would say. There is AB 1199 from Assemblymember Gibson, which is, I believe, a 2-year bill. Um, and if it's not, then I'm hoping it'll come back next year. And this is a bill around corporate landlords adding transparency so that folks know who their landlord is. A lot of times folks don't even know who owns their building. And there's so much concern right now because of COVID foreclosures that we will have corporate landlords swoop in and, you know, a repeat of what happened in the 2008 foreclosure crisis. And so it provides also sort of an excise tax on corporate landlords in order to be able to allow for greater transparency and support for efforts around community building. The other bill I wanted to flag, which also is a 2-year bill, also got held up, is AB 854, a bill from Assemblymember Lee. This is a bill that would reform the Ellis Act. The Ellis Act is a law that allows landlords to be able to evict their current tenants if the owner is going to move in, right? If the owner or a close relative is going to move in. We've seen that there are abuses to that where, the Ellis Act is not about, having the owner say they're moving in and then having it go back on the market or sold, in general. But the bill would provide a 5-year sort of holding requirement before a Ellis Act eviction can happen. And so just highlighting that there are a couple of bills obviously out there that we're looking at, and that some of the challenges. I mean, we've talked already about some of the bills that have gotten held up. Some of it is because of COVID. So let me just ask our panelists about how much COVID has impacted the legislative cycle and what are you all seeing on that? Chris, did you want to start us off with that question, and then I see Cynthia shaking her head, or let me just do a quick round of everybody. Chris.
Yeah, as I mentioned, a lot of the bills that were in the homelessness package from the assembly were created or were converted to 2-year bills because of this limit. This year, both chambers were really strict about this limit. So once an author got to 12 bills, they immediately transferred all the rest of their bills to either held or created or converted to 2-year bills. So I think what we're seeing this year is really a focus on the most, immediate term needs in bills, but also, typically where we would see bills that are related to budget requests still move forward until that budget process is over. We have seen bills that are in relation to budget requests converted to 2-year bills automatically because of the fact that we only have 12 bills and members were focused outside of the budget. So, we are seeing a lot of that happen, but and so that's why I think next year when we pick right back up, we're gonna have quite a few bills to work on right out the gate, particularly around this homelessness package.
Wonderful.
Right.
Cynthia.
I'll add a little bit to that, which is, in addition to the 12 limit, I mean, what hasn't COVID impacted, but the processes in the legislature have become much more opaque. It's been very difficult to kind of penetrate this sort of black box when it comes to a lot of the deals. There's also, I would note, been a lot of really progressive bills have been stopped and killed, and in a surprising way, and in not just housing areas, but I mean, in every issue area, there's been a lot of, if anything, maybe more moderate, Democrats or more moderate view of some of these progressive bills. Francisco mentioned the Ellis Act bill, and Lee also coming up with a social housing bill. All of these really progressive, lofty goals were really created and pushed back into the 2-year mark. So just another thing that COVID has sort of impacted.
Thank you. And Mark, why don't, if I don't know if you got anything to add to this COVID question, but if maybe you can also kick us off by just some of the remaining themes that you see will be sort of addressed in the final months of the legislative cycle. We've got at least 2 or 3, depending on how you can.
I would say that one of the overarching themes affecting everything housing related in the legislature this year is the demand by the state building and construction trades that all new housing funding, all new land use authorities require the use of union labor. Technically, they use the term a skilled and trained workforce, but it is defined in a way where really only union contractors can meet that requirement. And it is popping up everywhere. It is popping up in budget discussions. It's popping up in all kinds of big bills, little bills. And just to take one example, since it's a fairly big bill and one that a number of people in the questions have mentioned directly, SB 6 by Senator Caballero is meant to allow housing development in commercial zones, right? These are zones that have strip malls, whatever. We can convert them to housing, or at least they're zoned for retail. We can now build housing there. And she has accepted an amendment from the building trades to require the use of a skilled and trained workforce if anyone uses that bill. And the issue for us as affordable housing advocates, I mean, generally we're very sympathetic to the labor movement. Generally, we see a lot of benefit of working with unions, but we just don't have a union presence in many parts of the state, particularly the inland areas. And then even in more urbanized areas where there is a big union presence, we're not getting competitive bids now with both union and non-union contractors. If we take all the non-union contractors out of the mix, we won't be able to get bids, or we'll have one union bidder who has complete market power to drive the cost, set the price wherever they like. And so we've been trying to find a middle ground here, and in ways such that what we have proposed as the affordable housing community is to give union contractors a 10% bid preference, that they would, if their bid came in within 10% of another skilled and trained or prevailing wage bid, I should say, then we would then use the union contractor. Unfortunately, the building trades, well, we thought that was a very generous and reasonable proposal, and I would say everyone in the legislature has agreed with that. The building trades have rejected that. They want an absolute skilled and trained requirement. And so this has prevented a lot of bills from moving forward. We were wanting to do a CEQA expansion for supportive housing and affordable housing generally, as Scott Smith mentioned. And that bill never even though we had a lot of momentum from last year, that bill did not get out of the gate this year, was not even introduced, because until we resolved this labor issue, the author knew it had no chance. SB 6, the author has accepted this skilled and trained language, which probably means that very few people will ever use the bill. It may look good on paper, but it probably won't be very real. And in the budget discussions, it's come up about our labor provisions going to be applied to any of the new funds that I talked about earlier. And I think it looks like, it still remains to be seen, it looks like generally there won't be labor provisions on most of these financing sources, except for the home key, possibly. It is very possible that home key developments will be required to pay prevailing wage, and that they will be required to use a skilled and trained workforce with some guardrails that deal with these issues of not having union bidders in all parts of the state. Those guardrails are still being discussed. It's not clear what they might be. It may not be the 10% bid preference provision that we have recommended, but that has really been an overarching theme in every piece of legislation around housing this year. And at the bottom, I guess the bottom line is we are hoping that if the budget home key stuff does have a skilled and trained provision with guardrails that we can agree are appropriate and the trades finally accept, that would be the new model going forward, and we can move past beyond this polemic and actually find a way to work with the trades again and get some of these other bills moving.
Thank you, Mark. I appreciate it. Chris, any themes that you wanted to lift up?
No, I think Mark hit on the main one that we're seeing right now that has dominated the legislature and held up quite a few bills, and prevented a lot of stuff from happening in this year. But yeah, I think that's probably the main one. I think we're going to see a lot of work around accountability around homelessness funds. We keep hearing that theme around holding locals accountable to meeting goals and metrics, and actually ensuring that people are provided access to housing. So I think we're going to see some work around that both this year and probably next year. And as it relates to the budget this year, we'll probably see something happen around that front and meeting those goals.
Thank you. Appreciate it, Chris. We've been taking some questions already from in the Q&A platform. Cynthia, any final themes that you wanted to share, and also any administrative advocacy that you've got your eye on, and then we'll also see, I think Mark has something around that as well. So.
Sure. I mean, I actually don't have much to add on the theme discussion. I think, Western Center is looking forward to creating more of a conversation about equitable development next year. And I think we can all agree that it's been very tough 2 years. And so I think, given some of the changes recently, the legislature is also opening back up in a lot of ways, that next year we really hope to hit the ground running as a full back in session, quote unquote normal legislative session. So if anything, I think a lot more on the table than we've had in the past 2 years. Maybe we can get out of crisis mode. In terms of administrative, there's a couple of new reports that have been coming out that Western Center has been keeping an eye on. There's been some action on AFFH, affirmatively furthering fair housing, which I was remiss. We are co-sponsoring a bill, AB 1304, that would add more teeth to that process in the housing element process, and ensuring that we are undoing years and years of bad policy that has led to segregation. So AFFH is huge, and there's been some guidance on that we're reviewing. And that's it on my end. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you, Cynthia. Appreciate it. Mark.
I'm just going to do 3 quick bullet points because I know we're getting short on time with respect to administrative things. And particularly those in the development community should be aware that the debt limit allocation committee is revising its tiebreaker for 2022. And I think that's a big discussion. We expect to see kind of a proposal out probably in September, and it will go through the fall, but that's a big one. The Department of Housing just put out guideline changes for its multifamily housing program yesterday, and that comment period goes to August 6th. That's important for 2 reasons. One, because MHP is the biggest program that HCD runs, but 2, it is also going to be the template for which they award funds under 6 other programs next year under AB 434. So I would pay attention to that. And then last, we continue to work with all the 4 state housing agencies to try to get to our proverbial one-stop shop where all state rental housing resources, tax credits, bonds, loan funds would all be made available in a single competition, so a developer could get everything they need from the state at one place and in one time. So those are the 3 big things we're working on outside the legislature.
Thank you, Mark. Appreciate it. Chris.
Yeah, I'll be really quick as well. Related to the Homeless Coordinating and Financing Council, a couple really exciting things that they released this year. One is an action plan for the Coordinating Council to drive our state's effort in ending homelessness. It's a very robust plan with key principles and objectives. And so I'd really encourage folks to take a look at that. It is really well written and really well done. And then the other exciting thing is that the Coordinating Council also launched its data integration system, their HDIS, which is similar to a statewide HMIS, so that we can really have the data that we need around homelessness and drive decision making at the state and locally as to what we need to be doing. So I would encourage folks to take a look at that. It's an interactive tool. You can take a look online and see all the efforts that are being done around homelessness. And then one last plug before we go, which is that Mark and I, our organizations, have been co-leading the Roadmap Home effort, Roadmap Home 2030, and that the effort around a comprehensive bill and budget priority set of package around housing affordability, tenant protections, housing stability, and homelessness. And the Roadmap Home put forward a bill package in this year, as well as a budget priority package. So if you haven't yet, take a look at the Roadmap Home website and social media, and sign up for the email there to get alerted there. We will be continuing to advance those efforts in the next until 2030, which hopefully by then we will have achieved our goal, which is ending the housing affordability and homelessness crisis.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I think we're coming right in when we need to. I will, Chris, if you could put in the Roadmap Home website on the chat, that would be great. I'm including a petition that folks can fill out for and use as an email blast. You can actually edit this for your own organization on communicating with the governor and legislative leaders around the eviction, extending the eviction moratorium that we talked about earlier, and getting the rent relief out there. So we've covered so much. Really appreciative to our panelists and to Housing California for having this opportunity. I will put my email in the chat as well so folks can get a hold of me if folks are interested. And let me turn it back to Stephen to wrap us up.
Great. Thank you, Francisco. Thank you for a great moderation. And thank you to all of our speakers for sharing your deep insights into what's happening in Sacramento right now. And I'm going to double down on the plug for Roadmap 2030. I think what's key with that is that it's a plan that rises to the scale of the crisis. It doesn't try to be a Band-Aid. It actually is trying to look at root causes and long-term solutions. So we not only need to, follow the roadmap, we need to stay on the road for the next 8 years to get there. With regards to the conference here, please remember to check out the virtual exhibit hall. The more booths that you visit, the better your chances are at winning those prizes. And then at 10:45, join us for a plenary session with key housing and homelessness leaders in the administration, including State Controller Betty Yee, Secretary of the Business, Consumer Services and Housing Agency, Lourdes Castro Ramirez, and Secretary of Health and Human Services, Mark Galley. We're honored to have them here with us. We're honored to have all of you with us today. Thank you, and we'll see you there at the plenary.